That's just, I've met them. It's so much more dire than the Watergate period, and yet we continue to exist as a country, and we come out to events and we eat tacos for breakfast and the usual sort of thing. But on the continuum of state failure, where are we right now? And good morning. Thought I would start with something light.
Yeah. What a way to launch the...
Well, let's get right to it, man. I mean, we got a problem in this country.
Well, I'm not here to say it's better than it looks. I suspect it's a little bit worse.
But what do you mean by that?
Because the destruction is so profound. As you said, it's not just bad policy. It would be one thing if there were a lot of policies that I disagree with, which are bad, which of course is happening. But it's much more fundamental than that. The president, for example, has not only asserted control over the federal government and everything that it does, eroding or deleting any independence that exists within the policy apparatus, but is also asserting a level of control over civil society, academia, law, business, late-night comedy, right? That we have not seen, certainly in the United States, in modern times, and that is going to be very hard to recover from. Having said all of that, I'm not pessimistic. I believe that we have been through worse as a country. Not often, but we have.
Wait, parenthetical, when?
Well, in the middle of the 19th century, half of this country broke off and declared war against the first half for the purpose of being able to continue enslaving
Okay,
people,
there was
right?
that.
So
all right, fine.
We have been through worse. Not often, but my point is we have the means to get to a different and better place. But that's going to require an understanding that our task, and when we say, I know you're not partisan, I can be, so I especially mean our task as Democrats, but really anybody who's opposed to the carnival of destruction that's going on right now. The task is not to just put back what we used to have. And I'm very worried that we have a habit of mind in the Democratic Party that tells us, since all of this destruction is obviously terrible and wrong, our job is to somehow retake power and then get in there, find all the pieces of everything they broke, and tape it back together to what we had. The status quo. And the reality is, if our political and economic and social systems were acceptable, we wouldn't be here. Like, a guy like Donald Trump, a movement like a kind of proto-authoritarian nationalism or whatever you want to call it, doesn't find fertile ground in places where things are working, right? So we have to face the fact, partly because they've been destroyed, but partly because they were pretty rickety to begin with, that our inheritance as a country isn't making it reasonable in terms of your relationship to your government and society to get through everyday life, to get up in the morning and get in your car or get on the bus and get to work where you're going to be paid enough to live and be able to drop your kid off at a good school or childcare on the way and breathe clean air and do all the other things you need to do. It's not happening enough. And we have to be really deep in terms of what comes next. So I see a huge problem and a huge opportunity. Like, to me, the reason we should be propelled and not paralyzed in this moment is that we actually get to redesign what our country looks like. We have to, or else it's all over.
Step back and answer this question. How did Donald Trump and MAGA happen? You're suggesting that in a functional, healthy society, this movement would not have arisen. The question is, what gaps did they come through, and what is the role of social media in the rise, and reality TV before that, but reality TV and social media in the rise of this movement? And you know, the obvious question, we've talked about this before, is can democracy function in this social media and now AI cauldron?
Yeah, so it's harder, right? Think about what really happens when some dude on the internet has as much authority as a professional journalist, right? A professional journalist...
Cat Turd.
Yeah, for example.
There's a guy named Cat Turd who has more followers on Twitter than The Atlantic has subscribers.
Right. So,
and we have a lot of subscribers.
So if Cat Turd says something false, it's just there. Whereas if you were to publish something about me, for example, that was inaccurate, I would call you, or somebody would call somebody, and if we were right and we could prove it, you would issue a correction, right? And throughout my career, anytime I've been mad at South Bend Tribune, even Fox News, if we actually caught them saying something wrong, and we showed it, they would, as a matter of editorial integrity, they would adjust that. And if I said something wrong in an interview, they would correct me. That doesn't happen, obviously, in not just social digital media tweets and that sort of thing, but in many of the podcasts that have replaced the traditional media that we have depended on. Also, instead of an editor who's responsible not just for making sure that what's published is true, but for trying to arrange a set of things that meet your eye when you pick up a newspaper, for example, that you need to know as a citizen, you instead have that editorial function being played by an algorithm. The algorithm's job is not to find things that you need to know. The algorithm's job is to find things that'll keep you staring at the screen. It knows what your thumb will do. Your thumb is connected to your lizard brain. It is recording the preferences of your lizard brain, which, by the way, are very different than the preferences of your actual brain. In other words, if I sent you a survey saying, what do you want to see more coverage of, and you thought about it and you filled out the survey, the answer you would give is radically different from when you're like, Cracker Barrel? What the fuck? I'm going to click on that, right? It's just different. Having said all of that, I don't think that has to be fatal. But the key to this is bottom up. In other words, we have to become harder targets for bad and wrong and false, quote-unquote, information. And we have before, right? If I was walking down the streets of Austin in the 17th, I guess they didn't have streets here in the 17th century, but if I was walking down some street somewhere in the 17th century and you handed me a pamphlet printed with a printing press, I'd probably be so impressed that you had a printing press that I'd believe whatever was in there. And then eventually we became smart about not believing everything you read. And the same with radio, and the same with TV, and it's got to be the same with the internet.
Come back to this question. Let me try to phrase it more effectively. Would Donald Trump exist? Would Donald Trump be president today without this new and what you're describing as malfunctioning information environment? Or is he president because there was just broad unhappiness and weakness across America?
Both. So look, on the first question, he is an example of things that seem unprecedented, but they're more precedented than you would think. There is a long, rich American tradition of hucksters and conspiracy theorists, and in particular, rich men who take poor people's money while telling poor people they are being empowered. Like that is something that has happened from the get-go in this country. That's not novel. And there are other media environments, like the way the newspaper landscape looked in the 19th century, where somebody like that might have gotten ahead, right? Because that was a period when we each read our own newspaper that was ideological instead of this idea that the news was supposed to be objective. Okay, so we'll take that. That being said, it's also what's going on in this country. If you're, for example, much was made of the way that a lot of young people, young men in particular, drifted into his arms, right? A lot of that, I think, is related to the fact that young people, anyone younger than me, has witnessed mostly policy failure our entire lifetimes. I mean, there are exceptions, important ones, from the Affordable Care Act to the infrastructure bill that I worked on, but for the most part, you have witnessed things like the financial crisis, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and it's not just policy choices, it's outcomes. If you were born the year my mother was born, at the end of World War II, you had a 90% chance of coming out ahead of your parents economically. If you were born the year I was born, is a coin flip. Any younger than me, you're underwater. I managed to buy a house at the age of 30 in Indiana, at a time when the median age of a first-time home buyer was roughly 30. Now it's over 40. So all of these things are happening. Now, obviously, I will argue why Trump's policies and Republican policies tend to make them worse. But they also tend to create an environment where a lot of people who don't even like him will say, you know what, I'll try anything, including burning the house down, to have some shot of being better off. And those are the conditions that my party needs to understand have led us to be here. But the other thing I sense is that people do want a kind of relief from this political moment. I would argue the Trump era began 10 years ago last summer, the moment he came down that escalator. And as proud as I am of some policy accomplishments that happened when we were in power, the reality is for those 10 years, it's been his world, and we've been living in it. And it sucks. And increasingly, it's clear that his economy sucks. But again, the answer can't be like, great, let's take things back to the way they looked in 2022, right? So what we need to do is make it very clear what's coming next and recognize that if he's not disqualified, if somebody looks at him and doesn't think after everything we've seen that he's disqualified, then nothing about him is going to change their mind. And the more we're talking about him, the less we're talking about you.
So you're Midwestern through and through, Indiana, now you live in Michigan. You live around all sorts of good people who not only vote for Donald Trump, but believe in the almost spiritual message of MAGA. Have you ever succeeded in convincing a MAGA person that MAGA is a grift?
I mean, there are people who have felt betrayed by MAGA, but they're few and far between. I don't think it's about taking the true believers and showing them the error of their ways. But that's
the question. It's like we live in two alternate. We really do live in alternate realities now.
My point is that part comes later. What people need to see is something different and better, rather than like MAGA for or against. You are where you are on that by now. The question is anything going to make you better off? And we have potentially a better story to tell about this. That we have answers on what it would take for you to be able to buy a home, that what it would take for you to be able to afford health care. It's not just that he's taking it away from you. It's that we could do something different and better.
I want to get to some of your prescriptions in a minute, but I want to introduce into the conversation the biggest headwind possibly of all, the rise of AI. You are, because of your interests, predispositions, and your geography, you're obviously interested in blue-collar, non-college educated employment issues. AI is coming. Everybody has their own view of what it's going to do to the job picture. And by the way, this would be bipartisan in its effect. It's going to hurt the existing power structure, but it also could do serious damage to American spirit in a way that hurts the Democrats. Yep. How are you thinking about this? How are you folding AI organically into your thinking about what is coming and what we need to do as a country?
To me, everybody talks about AI like it's a tech story for obvious reasons. But I want to get us thinking about it a little more as a political economy story. That's the part that I think is not being looked at enough. Like, there's this idea that the AI is something you should be interested in and care about if you're interested in technology. But I think about it, as you hinted, from the lens of where I grew up. Because we actually have seen a version of this movie before. So in the 90s and the 2000s, in places like northern Indiana, where I was growing up, this wave of trade and automation, but honestly, mostly automation, came at the auto industry and related manufacturing industries. And a story was told to communities like where I lived. Basically went like this. This huge productivity burst is coming. Don't worry about your slice, because the whole pie is going to be so much bigger. We're all going to be better off. And the pie got bigger, but not for a lot of people in places like where I grew up. And when they got displaced economically, what followed was a lot of well-intentioned, often liberally funded job retraining programs, some of which was helpful in getting people new sources of income, but very little of which did anything to speak to how people had lost not only their source of income, but their sense of belonging. That when you were in the machinist union, and you've been doing that for 14 years, your spouses know each other from the union picnic, and that's how you're sponsoring the Little League, and your whole place in that community is connected to your work. So I'm invoking all of this because obviously, however fast or slow you think AI is ultimately going to unfold, it's going to do things like that at a much bigger scale. And it's going to do them to blue-collar and white-collar workers. And by the way, if you think blue-collar workers are reliant on their job for a sense of where they belong, think about doctors and lawyers and software people in your life and how reliant they are on their job or their particular industry as a source of their sense of belonging, right? And so we're going to have to be ready for, I think, a twofold crisis. One, more immediate and more obvious about income. And then a second one, a little bit harder to see, but I think very deep and very real.
The meaning.
Yeah, like where you fit, what are you doing? And by the way, there's a very happy version of how it could theoretically unfold, where we all have a shorter work week and more money in our pocket, and all the things that give us the most meaning, which I think most of us deep down would say should go beyond work, and it's different for everybody, but can be family or faith or service or country or community. Like there are good answers for this. And then, of course, there are terrible answers for this, like nationalism and bigotry. And this is part of, again, what I think Trumpism is about. I actually think Trump and Vance are very much about belonging. It's a weird thing to say, but they're about belonging. It's just their picture of belonging is drawn through who you would get to exclude, right? But all of that is only finding fertile ground because of what we've been through already just from the last couple of shocks.
So, if you were president, would you try to regulate AI? And what would that regulation look like?
Well, thanks.
I thought you were cheering for AI, actually, for a minute. I wasn't tracking that.
I mean, yeah, of course, on some level, we've got to have guardrails, first of all, around security, safety and security, right? The possibility of these things being used to, for example, effectively print a lethal virus or undermine the foundations of nuclear non-proliferation or a whole lot of other frightening things require policy. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be totally prescriptive. There's a spectrum. And this, if you'll indulge me, I will do a little bit of transportation analogy here because I think it's important.
It's inevitable.
So, on a mature, well-understood, developed technology like commercial aviation, you do a lot of very specific regulation that can deliver remarkable safety outcomes. So when the time just in the 4 years I was secretary, we had 4 billion passenger enplanements, 4 billion times somebody got on an airliner, and 0 crash fatalities. And that happened because of an incredibly specific and honestly sometimes burdensome system that makes sure that everything is checked 10 times, right? On the other end of the spectrum, also in the FAA, we regulated commercial space travel, which was so new, so novel, that if you tried to prescribe every nut and bolt, the industry wouldn't be able to develop. And so the regulatory framework was much looser. It basically said, don't hurt anybody if you blow up when you're still on the ground. And since you have to get through the national airspace on your way up, you have to do that safely. And a lot of other things were looser. So we can turn the dial based on what's appropriate. But of course we have to have some regulation. But I'm not just worried about the technology regulation. I'm worried about the concentrations of power and wealth that come with the ownership of these companies. And we're already at a level of inequality in this country, of wealth and income inequality, that is honestly past what any republic has attained and managed to survive as a republic. So we're not quite as unequal as France was before the French Revolution or the Aztec Empire before its collapse, but we're kind of headed that way. And that was before this happened. What this could do is concentrate wealth and therefore power in even fewer hands. That is a job for policy. Before I'm in there trying to figure out the guts of a large language model and some regulation to make sure that it doesn't generate harmful material, which I think is less obvious to be something that government would be good at. We need to just have good old-fashioned economic policy, like, taxes.
But how do you, let's just continue with the idea that you're going to be in power someday on a national level. How do you disempower Elon Musk, Sam Altman, the people who run Google, and so on? How do you do that in a system that is already weighted toward money?
Concentrations of wealth always lead to concentrations of power. And we're supposed to have some checks against that in our system. The fact that Elon Musk's vote counts the same as mine, but obviously his power is different because he can deploy huge amounts of money. And the erosion, the destruction really of the guardrails around money in politics is another one of the reasons we are where we are. Interestingly, it was pretty healthy national consensus that we got to do something about that. Now, in the long run, that's going to take a constitutional amendment. We need a constitutional amendment to say that money is not the same thing as speech, and corporations aren't the same thing as people. Will that happen next year? Of course not. All the more reason to start pushing for it now. Meanwhile, we have to take other measures. What does that look like? Well, interesting things are happening around the country. A very conservative place like Montana is trying to address this through attention to what a corporation can and can't do, because that's actually decided at the state level. So instead of working it at the speech side of the equation, they're working at the what is a corporation side of the equation. That might be part of it. But the reality also is, again, because economic power and concentration tends to find its way into political concentration of power, on some level this has to do with directly dealing with the inequality. It's just not true that someone who was a multi-billionaire 10 years ago and saw their wealth increase tenfold in the last 10 years did so because they are 10 times more valuable to the US economy now than they were then. These are distortions that have to do with power, not market outcomes that just come from the cosmos. And we should do something about that as a matter of policy.
Is Zohran Mamdani the future of the Democratic Party?
You just had to do that.
Well, you're talking about fixing problems at the top end. People are making too much money. There's a more conservative Democratic approach, which is, look, I don't care how rich Elon Musk gets as long as you aren't poor. In other words, like bring up the bottom.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of hostility toward billionaires right now. I mean, it's focused on the tech guys for a whole range of social, cultural, technological disruption reasons.
My point is, all of this is related. I guess I'd put it this way. We have levels of inequality that are not sustainable. Like a society can't reach these levels of inequality and stay healthy. And there's kind of three ways to go on this, two of which I disagree with. The right's answer is just let it go. Don't worry about it. Or it's really crony capitalism, right? So, we don't need to rehash it here, but all of the things that Trump is doing, favors for friends, the government taking equity stakes in companies but not with any rationale behind it, trade policy designed to put your company, your industry, or your country's future at the whim of the president, right? That's their flavor of it. But there's that kind of either unconstrained capitalism or crony capitalism over here. And then you got the answer from folks to my left, which is socialism, anti-capitalism. And to me, in between crony capitalism or unrestrained capitalism and anti-capitalism or socialism is where most of us actually are, which is a kind of democratic capitalism. A capitalism where you constrain the ability of the most powerful people and corporations to hurt you, while also enabling them to do the things that only they can do, to grow the economy, to increase productivity, to create jobs. That's where the center of gravity of America is and has been. So I think, obviously, I belong to a party that has a big coalition, from people who are way to my left, like Zoran Mamdani, to people like, you know, people who did well as moderates in competitive races as recently as last week.
Well, give us your analysis of the results of the election earlier this month. There's a disproportionate amount of attention, I think, on Mamdani because most national reporters live within 5 blocks of where he lives. But talk about what Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill mean too, because this is a little bit harking back to when everybody talked about the squad, but there were 100 Democrats in Congress who were in moderate 50-50 districts who were like, please stop talking about the squad. We're the heart of the Democratic Party. Give us your analysis of what the results mean, not only within the Democratic Party, but what it means about the electorate and where the energy is.
Yeah, so look, a Democratic candidate winning in New York City is not an earth-shaking event, although obviously
Democratic
there was
Socialist
something
winning
distinctive.
is, though.
Yes, there was something distinctive in that campaign and what it did. But you know, by the numbers, what historically would be considered more surprising was that in statewide races in New Jersey and in Virginia, they didn't just win. I kind of hoped and expected they would win. And I campaigned with each of them in the days leading up to the election. It's that they won by more than even the optimistic scenarios would suggest. And things happened in places like a public utility commission race in Georgia, right? Also that were part of this pattern. This is exciting. Got some Georgia folks here? All right. Why? Well, obviously it wasn't because all of these people had the same answers. Like the answer on offer in New York was very different from the answer being offered in Virginia. The point is, for once, every Democrat you saw was talking about the right question. And the question is, what can we do using the pulleys and levers of government to make you better off on the biggest problems in your life, which right now mostly have to do with the fact that it's unaffordable to be an American? And getting the question right is table stakes, but that's actually been a struggle for us sometimes, us meaning my party.
Okay, well, stay on that.
Yeah.
What is wrong with your party?
Well, where do we begin? You know, I do think there was a sense that we were not asking the right questions or not offering answers to the right questions. I think that was largely or partly unfair.
Were you actively asking the wrong questions? And obviously, I'm hinting at the basket of cultural issues, which seemed only to turn off people.
Look, I think we got sucked into an account of America that defined everything by identity at the expense of everything else. And what it meant was, you know, there were expressions in the Democratic Party that suggested that all that matters to where you fit and is based on your identity, and therefore the only things we can do for you have to do with your identity. And it turns out that if you do it that way, you can't stitch together a story that makes sense across the board. And you actually lose many people in the very identity groups you think you're talking to. Because not because they are Latino, but because they are people. A lot of Latino voters said, why aren't you saying more about my economic future? And you could say the same for black voters, and you could say the same for young men and a lot of other people who got away from us. So we don't need to water down our commitment to racial and economic justice as a party. We need to remember that all this ladders up into a big picture about what it's like to be an American, and to have a story about what it's like to be an American, including making sure you can afford to get through everyday life, and what it means to be an American, which directly challenges the kind of J.D. Vance model that you're an American based on how many of your ancestors are in a Civil War cemetery. Basically blood and soil nationalism, and say, no, being American has to do with your fidelity to a creed that binds us together, that explains why being American is different than being Belgian or Japanese. We're not just another country out there. We're a country that developed based on this commitment to democratic equality, the idea that everyone is created equal.
But you just stay on one thing for a minute. You just invoked the expression blood and soil nationalism, which obviously rings more ominously in the original German. And you said that our current vice president is a blood and soil nationalist. Do you think that J.D. Vance is a fascist?
If it's convenient for him to be a fascist, he'll be a fascist. Maybe later on he'll go back to being a Silicon Valley Democrat. He'll be whatever he needs to be. Right? I mean, this is a guy who went from Donald Trump as Hitler, what he said, to, I have seen the error of my ways. He'll be something new later on, maybe. But that's my point, is that what he's preaching, right, does tap into a vein of something that every society, including ours, has. This idea that your belonging depends on your participation in this kind of ethno-religious.
Okay, to you, what is American exceptionalism?
The American exception is our commitment to democratic equality. Yes, now it's not so exceptional, but we led the way. And with that comes a whole set of commitments and beliefs around what it takes to make sure that the government works for the people and not the other way around. We built that. We invented that stuff. And we should take more pride in it. That's why of all of the very, 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 very many terrible things the president did, the one that is the most dangerous and the most harmful still is going after the integrity of our elections, because the elections are the beating heart of not just our government, but our nation, right? We came up with that. Now, because we came up with it first, we got a lot of things in our system that are still kind of 1.0. Like our basic law, our Constitution, is the hardest to amend of pretty much any constitution in any democracy. There's a great new book by Jill Lepore on the history of constitutional amendments. One of the great innovations of America was the idea of a constitution that you can amend, which most countries do, most states do.
If you want to read a little snippet of that, it's on the cover of the Atlantic.
Oh, how about that?
Month. Jill Lepore, thank you. That was a sponsor message.
We have these weird things like being the only presidential democracy in the world where you can come in with the second most votes and get to be president, and the person who got the first most votes doesn't. That makes no sense, obviously, right?
Well, it does. To be fair to small states, it does make sense.
No, it doesn't.
No, it does, because you have
It doesn't even benefit small states. It just benefits some states.
Without that possibility, the small states would be run over entirely by the large states, no? I mean,
no.
I'm not a particular partisan for
No, I'm sorry.
Small states for South Dakota, but it's
South Dakota has been screwed by the Electoral College. And I'll tell you why.
That's a very esoteric fan club there.
Two reasons. First of all, the way it works, a small state like South Dakota gets less votes has less importance than a medium state like Michigan, where I live. But also because if you live in South Dakota, what matters more to your future? How many presidential candidates come through and stage rallies in a community near you? Or the fact that soybean prices are cratering because of a president whose political career was catapulted by the fact that he got to be president in the 2016 election, even though he got the second most votes. If you live in South Dakota, disproportionately more of my generation went to a war in Iraq that would not have been fought if the person who got the most votes in 2000 got to be president instead of the person who got the second most votes. So I would argue that all kinds of Americans have been screwed by the Electoral College no matter where you live.
Well, I'm not 100% sure that the alternative history is, I mean, you don't know what Al Gore would have done, but put
I'm
that
pretty
aside.
sure that we are worse off because of the last two cases in which the loser of the vote in the presidential election got to be president. And but you know what? Another piece of evidence for this. I'm sorry, you're going to be going on a nerdy pursuit here, maybe, but when we run a race,
Don't worry, you have experts on South Dakota's political throw weight throughout this.
When we run a race for governor, we don't say your vote counts differently depending what county you live in. We don't do this in any other election in America, let alone any other democratic system around the world, because it's not fair and it doesn't make any sense.
I have to say, though, that you may be right about every single point, but the system is not fixable at the level that you want to fix it, possibly in your lifetime, and you're a young guy. I mean, to the extent that
this is
you
the thing,
can't
though.
amend the Constitution anymore. That's kind of Jill Lepore's point.
The country is burning down. And this is a country that managed to change the Constitution such that you couldn't get a beer, and then realized it was a dumb idea and changed the Constitution again. These are not things from the 16th century. They happened within, if not living memory, then within a human lifetime or two.
What's the single point reason that we can't do what we did in the 20s 100 years later? Concentration of power?
Well, there's concentration of power. There's also, to get back to the kind of the political analysis, this urban-rural divide that is another symptom, among other things, of a problem in my party. Look, we used to have actual landslides in this country, like landslide elections. Trump said he had a landslide when he barely got 50%. But as you know, we had actual landslides not that long ago, like within my lifetime. Johnson or Mondale, right? We had 60-40 presidential elections. And when that happens, or when you have less polarized parties, or when you have fairer districts, you can have more strange bedfellows, more interesting coalitions, more complicated politics, and more things get done, especially on the things where most people agree. One really interesting thing is on most issues, on most of the biggest issues people name, there is not just a 51% majority, but a 60 or 70% majority for things that I and a lot of other people believe in. On taxes, most people, not 50%, like 60 or 70%, believe that it is the wealthiest who need to pay their fair share and the working class who need a break, not the other way around. On choice, most people believe that a decision like that should be made by the woman facing the decision about her own health, right? Even on immigration, most people believe that we should make it harder to come to this country illegally and easier to come to this country legally, and that there should be some pathway to citizenship for the people who are here. On issues where my party is used to being in a defensive crouch, like guns or marriage, most people are with us at least on background checks. Most people are with us on marriage. So then the question is, okay, if we got 60 or 70% agreement on most of the big issues, how are we struggling to get 50% in the election? And I have a couple responses to that. One is we should probably put forward better communicators about that message.
Anyone in particular you're thinking about?
Just generally. But secondly, obviously there are a bunch of folks who would agree with us in a survey on the issues, but don't like Democrats. And the number one reason they don't like Democrats is they think we don't like them.
Condescension?
Yeah.
Was Hillary Clinton's deplorable remark the kind of that was the fatal turn for your party?
I mean, it definitely crystallized something, right? And captured something. It's a bit ironic if you go look at the game tape. What she was trying to say was different, but it's more than that. I mean, it's more than one remark, right? Those things only a moment, a remark, a gaffe only becomes defining if it taps into a vein of something. And there is this sense, and it's not unjustified. I remember feeling this way when I went from South Bend, Indiana to Harvard as a college student. And, people, like intelligent, educated people who just, no matter how many times I told them where I was from, could not remember whether I was from Idaho, Iowa, or Indiana. And then after I was there and when I decided to move home, people the moment I said I'm moving back to Indiana, the first question when I'm standing, I remember I was in San Francisco holding a beer at somebody's apartment at a party, and they said, "Oh, like, are your parents not well?" Like, going home to take care of a dying relative was the only reason you would go back to flyover country. Like, this stuff is real. And you know, even though we're the party that thinks we care most about the people who have least, you know, still use phrases like, you know, voting against your own interests, which, I'm sorry, but if like a coastal liberal lawyer tells, you know, a welder who lives near me in Michigan, like, you're voting against your own economic interest, he's going to say, so are you, right? We've got to do better in the way we talk, the style, the approach, the messenger, the people we put up, or else it's going to stay that way.
I'm not going to ask you if you're running for president, because 45% of the speakers at the Texas Tribune Festival are running for president. I'm just assuming that you are. I want to ask you, before we have some questions from the audience. I want to ask you about something that Kamala Harris said. Kamala Harris wrote in her book that you were her #1 choice. She wanted you to be the vice presidential nominee. By the way, congratulations on not being asked. That worked out well. But she said that you both agreed that the country wasn't ready for a gay vice president. So the question for you is the country ready for a gay president? And by the way, if this were the country, I think we have our answer. But
look, I wouldn't have run for president in 2020 if I didn't think so.
But go to what she said. Is that a fair analysis of your position?
No.
Okay. Why did she say that?
I don't know.
You don't know why she said that?
No.
Oh, okay.
I was surprised when I read her view of what she thinks we agreed on. Look, when I came out, I was already the sitting mayor of South Bend. I was a bachelor mayor. For a while, I could just say, hey, the city's a jealous bride. That's why I'm single. And to some extent, that was true. And I didn't even mind that much until I got deployed. I've told the story many times, but you know, when you get deployed, you write a letter. I was deployed as a reservist. It was while mayor. It was a strange status shift to go from being mayor of the city to Lieutenant Pete, but that's what happened. And I got pulled out of my day-to-day life as an elected official in Indiana and into a new life. And while I was at it, I was told to write a letter for what to do if I don't come back, and had to assess my life in a page. And realized how strange it was that I was a grown-ass man with a home and a job and the mayor of my city in my 30s with no idea what it was like to be in love, and decided that had to change if I came back okay. And I came back, and then I changed it in what inconveniently was an election year. In Mike Pence's Indiana. He was governor. And I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if I would lose friends. I didn't know how guys I served with would respond. I didn't know how voters would respond. But I knew that that was what I was going to do. And I did. And I got more votes. I won by more the second time in that re-election than I did the first time. Because it turned out most people didn't care about my personal life. They cared about how the way I did my job as their mayor was going to affect their lives. That's what politics is about. It's about your life, not mine. And, you know, in Iowa, which we won, the Iowa caucuses, would have been nice to find that out on the day of the caucuses instead of much later. But our margin, we would not have won if it weren't for a lot of people who were independents, or what I like to call the future former Republicans, who were willing to cross over and caucus to support me. So, you know, I guess those are the experiences I can draw on that shape my faith, that you can give people a lot of credit to look at you and what you have to offer and size you up, not based on what they think of you, but based on what they think you'll do for them. And that's how I think politics works, or ought to work.
Great. So I think we have questions from the audience. They're going to be read, I guess, yes.
Hi, I'm Darla Cameron with the Texas Tribune. Thank you for your great questions. The first one up. Mariana from Austin asks, we all drove here. How do you see the future in terms of a provision for alternative modes of transportation?
Told you we were going to get to transportation.
Just say horse and go on.
Yeah. So we can't go on as a country where most places you have no choice but to bring 2,000 pounds of metal with you anywhere you go. It doesn't make sense. There are places that are going to be like that. I live in a pretty rural part of Michigan. But even there, we could do much more with transit if there were the funding. My friend Steve Adler is here somewhere. As mayor, he led extraordinary efforts to make this a community with access to the kinds of transit that people deserve, knowing that it doesn't only benefit you if you do use it, but it also benefits you if you don't use it because there's less cars on the road to compete with, right? Like, some of this is really commonsensical, and it's why we made the biggest investment in transit in American history when I was secretary, and we're proud of that. And there's still a long way to go. But when you do that right, it is more functional, it's more efficient, it's cleaner and greener, of course. Importantly, also safer. And that's the other thing that I think we really need to focus on in the future of transportation. I talked about the civilizational achievement of aviation safety. But our civilizational shame in transportation is that we accept a level of carnage on our roads. Enough people will die today in car crashes in America to fill a 737. And that happened yesterday, and it'll happen tomorrow. We chipped away at it when I was in charge of transportation. There's a long way to go. And that will require policy. It will require commitment, especially at the local level. And technology has a role to play, too. We crossed paths with one of those Waymo cars on the way up here. And I will tell you, the potential of those vehicles is a big part of the safety future of transportation in this country, too.
What do you do about the millions of people who drive for a living? How do you balance the safety need versus the employment need?
Yeah. Well, professional drivers are different than most of us. So the average driver thinks they're safer than the average driver. This is a consistent finding. But when we're talking about folks like truck drivers, I mean, I met drivers who had 2 million, 3 million miles accident-free. So I don't want to suggest that me driving the minivan is the same thing as a trained professional driver. But look, obviously the future is changing when it comes to this, and that will entail big changes for how a lot of people get their income, and there's no escaping that.
Pat from Oak Hill asks, especially in red states, it's difficult to protect the most vulnerable from government persecution. What do you suggest we do?
Well, especially in red states, people need to speak up and stand up and defend your neighbors who are vulnerable. This can't just be a top-down thing. But I do think a lot of our salvation will come from the local. Part of what's changing the atmosphere around all of this right now is that people are realizing an attitude they might have about, whatever, an undocumented immigrant, a trans student, in theory, is very different from how they feel about a member of their family or a neighbor or somebody they've known who is now getting roughed up by these kinds of horrible policies, or worse. I mean, we saw a version of this in the first Trump administration, a guy who owned a local business and by all accounts was a really beloved member of the community who went in to check on his green card process and got immediately deported. And there were a lot of people, I mean, really conservative, Trumpy people who said, I did not think when I said, vote for Trump, get these bad people out, that they meant someone like Roberto. We love Roberto. It was a bit too late to see that. Closer to home, we actually see each other as people. And all that is good in politics and society comes from being able to see people, even those different from us, as people. Just as all that is bad, evil in society and politics comes from us considering another person as something other than a person. The best solutions to this are from the ground up, and they start by finding the individual cases where these things are at stake, where it's not a statistic or a talking point, but a human being, and making sure that that story gets out. And that is one of the better things that can come of digital media, is stories are being told that we never would have known about if it weren't for that.
Cassandra from Houston asks, with the increasing pressure on academia, how do you foresee bridging the gap between policy makers and subject matter experts?
Oh, what a great question. Because I think, weirdly, the left has actually struggled compared to the right in terms of our relationship between policymakers and experts or academics. Consider Project 2025, which, among other things, is the culmination of years or even decades of work linking very basic first principles thinking going on at places like the Cato and the Heritage Foundation. They're not the kind of think tanks that are just thinking about what should sugar subsidies be like or what's the optimal healthcare incentive structure for Medicaid uptake. They're thinking about what is the nature of liberty. And then they come up with these answers, many of which, of course, I think are wrong. And then they get to these policy outcomes, and then they have their universe of people who have been educated, you might say indoctrinated on this, and they get the jobs. There's this whole ecosystem that they built. And the right built that ecosystem because they thought they had to, because they thought the left controlled academia. And academia, of course, has tilted left. But then academia started concerning itself with things that have less and less to do with everyday life. And so we're actually kind of alienated from a lot of the deeper thinking that has gone on. My father was a translator of Antonio Gramsci, a very left Italian thinker who died when he was in prison under Mussolini. Most of the people who pay attention to him now are on the right. Among other things, he wrote about how culture leads to political. Basically, he was the first person to say, although I don't think he said it in these words, and it was in Italian anyway, that politics is downstream from culture. The left needs to up its game in terms of the intellectual rigor and the connective tissue of the relationship between our policymakers and our thinkers. I mean, don't get me wrong, when I was Secretary of Transportation, I had access to great thinking on how we might structure safer streets for vulnerable road users, or the different energy scenarios leading to adoption of sustainable aviation fuel. But if I was trying to think through like a philosophy of public works, I knew that my counterparts on the right had done more groundwork than we had. And I think that is not a project that will be taken up in one cycle, and people like me can't furnish all the answers to this. But we need to build much more both inside and outside of academia to help us contend with that deficiency on the left. Meanwhile, also, and I say this having just read the latest news out of Texas A&M, there's something much more basic, of course, which is this administration is attacking academia, attacking universities, not because of their leftism, but because of their independence. And we need universities because of their independence, and we need to defend their independence.
Is the Democratic deficit on big think, coherent, this is what America is, articulation, is that a byproduct of the captivity of the party in the hands of identitarian people and the quote-unquote groups, the single interest, special interest groups? Like, you can't have an e pluribus unum moment in the Democratic Party because everybody just has their one lane?
I think it's related. Look at the contest over our museums, where part of how the right has attacked museums for portraying the entirety of American history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is by saying if you ever talk about the bad and the ugly, you must hate America. When the reality is the reason we need to talk about the bad and the ugly is that some of the best things about America are how we overcame some of that. And some of the most important things yet to be done in America is how we overcome what's left. But the reality is there have been voices, movements, groups on the left who have become vulnerable to being caricatured as only caring about the bad and the ugly, and seeing that as the totality of the American experience, which of course is a very easy thing to exploit in the hands of folks like the people running our government now.
What is the greatest hope that you have for your children and others as so many institutions of learning are being challenged?
So our kids are 4. And conveniently, they're not quite old enough to be asking me about politics or their future yet. But I know it's coming. Like, I was 2 years ago, actually, when I put the kids to bed, I started getting this question. You know, the bedtime routine with kids gets more elaborate right around the age of 2 or 3, and you gotta. So right after we put them down and we got dim the lights and we got the blankets and we read the book and then we checked for dinosaurs in the hallway, and then I certified that there are no monsters in the closet, and then I promised to tell the fire truck nearby to be quiet, and we get through everything, and then suddenly at the last minute our daughter starts saying, "Papa, tell me your work." And I remember asking her after she did it a couple times, like, does me talking about work help you go to sleep? She said, yeah. And I tried, and at first I was so in my head about what I was doing. I was like, well, okay, we got talking to the Appropriations Committee tomorrow. We're trying to get the budget markup done. Then I got an NPRM on the new regulation on emergency braking, and then I got to talk to this senator about and then I realized, like, no, I should be able to at least try to explain what I'm doing to a toddler. And I started doing it. I started saying, you know, tomorrow I'm gonna help make the airplanes safer. You know, when we had that terrible crisis in Baltimore, you know, a bridge fell down, and I'm gonna help the people who are putting it back together. And I realized that, like, the ultimate accountability for what we're doing is very well captured in the question of whether you can explain it to a child. But also, as they've gone from 2-year-olds to 4-year-olds, I see how quickly they're going to be 30. And my daughter's going to be, and son are going to be looking at me asking, like, what were you doing back in the 2020s? Which will be poetic justice for me telling my parents that I envied them living in the 60s and being young then. Which they had to explain to me was not as fun as it looks now. It was actually a very painful time. It looks cool now because we can look back on it and romanticize it, but actually their friends are going to war and their heroes are being assassinated, and they didn't actually know that we'd get through it. And so part of how I think about how we have to do right by them, knowing that all these things they don't get a vote on are being decided right now, from the financial and fiscal sustainability of this country and its government, to our great power relationship to China, to the way we're going to deal with artificial intelligence, to what social media is doing, not only to our society, but to our brains. Quick parenthetical here. It's remarkable to see the bipartisan coalition around doing something on social media. We just kind of let social media break our politics, but we're not going to let it break our kids. And that's an interesting sign of hope that there's some serious policy action constraining that. But anyway, all these decisions are going to be made that will kind of decide by the middle of this century, when they're setting out into their working lives, how much of a shot they have at doing well. And we've got to do right by them. So I think our charge is to face the fact that the times we live in they're not like the 60s, they're worse. But they're so bad that when we meet the moment and think originally about what we want to put in place for our kids to thrive, they will romanticize the 2020s because of what we were up against and what we did to get through it.
Pete, thank you very, very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was great. Appreciate it.